Hey guys, this is Jennifer with Midwest Wilderness Connections, and I'm out at the Allerton Park and Retreat Center in Monticello, Illinois. And I was actually teaching a botanical bas-relief class and was leaving and noticed that they are conducting a prescribed fire in the woods. As you can see here, a lot of people are familiar with the fact that you would want to use prescribed fire to manage prairie. Not as many people are familiar with using prescribed fire to manage woodlands. In the Midwest, a lot of the forests were more open and they were described as park-like, which means there were fewer trees, they're kind of scattered, there wasn't a ton of shade, it was a little more open, had more of an underground or understory layer called a herbaceous layer. And over time, what we did is usually fire, large herbivores, things of that sort, helped keep those types of conditions, those open woodland conditions. And we've removed a lot of those, what are called maintenance processes. And so here, what you can see is at Allerton, they are reintroducing fire into the ecological system to try to get back to that original natural state where you thin out the trees, because you can see a lot of the trees around me here are very young. See how thin they are? There are some trees in here that are very large, and so what if you went out and you mapped, you could see historically how many fewer trees there actually were out here in the past. And for some reason something changed, whether it was the removal of fire, it was potentially the area, a lot of these areas used to be grazed because they used to have an understory. For some reason, grazing stopped, they took the cattle off, whatever it may be. And so new little trees started popping up everywhere because they weren't controlled by anything. And what happens over time is all these little trees come in, they start shading and increasing the amount of shade that gets down to the forest floor. And then the forest grasses, the wildflowers, sedges, the plants, the understory plants, they get shaded out. They don't have enough light. Then what you end up having is you start getting a lot of bare soil areas. And so if you walk into woods and you just got a lot of bare soil and there's just not a lot of undergrowth under the trees, that's a major problem. Because what happens is the soil's exposed when it rains. That soil that's exposed is exposed and available for travel and movement. And so when it comes to water or wind, it's going to pick that soil up, move it somewhere else. If it's water, it's going to move it to the nearest stream. And then that stream is going to move it to the nearest river. So then you start getting water pollution problems. So it's kind of a snowball effect. And so what they're doing here at Allerton is they're trying to control the situation. They're trying to get back to a healthy state. So they're coming through, and you can see it's not like a prairie fire. If any of you have seen a prairie fire, you know that it's ripping and roaring because the vegetation is so dense and so flammable that it just really lights and poof. And then you get this huge, just this line of fire with really high flame lengths. You don't have that in a woodland burn because usually the soil and the material, I'm going to look here, you can see there's a lot of leaf litter. It's got a little more moisture to it, so it's not going to burn as intense or as hot. It's going to creep because there's not as much matter either. It's called fuel. There's not as much fuel for the fire, so it just progresses a little more slowly, so it's kind of a creeping fire. And there are some spots, I can't get out there because I'd have to go through the fire line to see, but there are going to be some spots out there that didn't burn as well as others, and that's good for the most part, generally speaking, because you want patchiness of your burn. You want areas that burned a little more than others, areas that were left unburned. Usually areas that are left unburned or unburned because maybe there was a log laying down that stopped the fire and it was more moist on one side of the log than the other. That's where your salamanders are hiding out. It may be that you've got a patch of leaves in a little low-lying area that was maybe a little wetter so they didn't burn. There are certain plants and animals that are adapted to those types of conditions, and the reason that they're adapted to those conditions, they've evolved under those conditions, they need those conditions, that's why they survive there. And so if you come along with your fire, in this case they're probably using drip torches, which are torches, they're filled with fuel that they light and it drops fire, fire lit fuel. Don't come around with your drip torch and hit every one of those patches, because if you do that, you're homogenizing the landscape, which 9 times out of 10, if you're doing this work, all the work you're doing is trying to stop the homogenization, the monotypic. You don't want everything the same. You want it patchy, you want it diverse, you want it messy to an extent. So keep that in mind too. The other thing about fire, what it does is it comes through, it's going to kill weeds. A lot of the weeds are susceptible to fire because they weren't adapted to fire. If we go back and look at these leaves again, I don't know how great you guys are with plant ID, but we have a lot of oak leaves. All right. There's a lot of white oak in here. White oak, this is a red, but there's a lot of white oak. Red oaks have pointy tips on the leaves. Here's a white oak. All right, here's a white oak, and you see how the lobes are rounded. White oaks, generally speaking, are more fire adapted. Red oaks have pointier tips. See how they have those pointier tips on them? They usually don't like as much fire, again, generally speaking. And so what happens is the white oaks usually have thicker bark that protects them from the fire. And so the thinner barked trees that don't really belong in a fire adapted system are more susceptible to the fire. The heat gets to them and they end up dying. But with those oaks, they have that thick corky bark, and so it protects them from the fire. And then also the leaves, if you look at these leaves, the oak leaves, do you see how open and airy? Let me zoom out here. All right, see how open and airy these leaves are? There's a lot of air in there. That allows fire. That's an adaptation that the oak needs, that fire, in order for it to maintain dominance in the ecosystem. So it actually encourages fire by its own design. They create leaves that get very dry, and they curl up and create a lot of airspace. What does fire need? Air, a lot of oxygen. All right, and so the oaks actually encourage the spread of fire in a system. If you don't get fire for long enough in a system, you get too many maple trees or trees like that, they drop their leaves. Their leaves hold a lot of moisture and they're flat. And they can actually create this flat, slippery mat that actually discourages fire. So it's kind of the opposite effect. And so, how you're going to manage a system once you get those maples in there and you don't have a good fuel layer for burning, you're going to have to go in there, open up the canopy, dry it out. You're going to have to do some mechanical removal of trees. Get a forester, but what you want to do is you want to get a forester that is more in tune with habitat management. If you're doing this for wildlife, not so much a forester that's really well versed in like timber harvest. There's a big difference in foresters. Some of them are kind of agronomous crops for trees, which is fine if that's what the intent is. But if you're really going after wildlife habitat, diversity, ecological systems, make sure you get a good one who understands how you would use fire, when you would use fire, where you would use fire, how often you would use fire. That takes an eye. You don't just use fire every 5 years. You have to look at the site, look at the plants coming up, and say, oh, the plants that I'm worried about, they're getting prevalent enough, I need to burn now to keep them in check. So you got to have somebody with the knowledge and the skills to be able to do that. Have them help you put together a management plan if you'd like to do something like this with your property, or if you've got a park in your area that you think could really benefit from this, because this can help with a lot of our woodlands right now are full of invasive shrubs and things, and fire is a way to help take care of that. I know, like some of the honeysuckles and stuff, people have been having some luck. They still need to use some herbicides and things, but an April burn, from what I've heard, has been helping quite a bit. But anyway, I was just so happy. I wasn't expecting this. I was teaching a class nearby at the retreat center and just happened to come upon them doing a burn, and thought it was a great time to stop and talk to you guys about it a little bit. I could go on about this on and on for days. Oh, I am going to tell you one more thing. It won't be days though, I promise. If you look, I'm going to zoom in because this is important. One of the other things the fire is doing, you see the fire's coming up on this woody debris and it's charring it. Woody debris is extremely important habitat, like I mentioned earlier. That's where your little salamanders and things that have moist skin, that need moisture, need to stay damp, they're under there. So the moisture under there is going to keep them safe from this fire. But what's happening is those charred areas of this woody debris, the charred areas of the woody debris decompose more slowly than the parts that aren't charred. So what happens is it's going to lengthen the lifespan of that woody debris. So what you're doing there is, I keep talking about patchiness and diversity. So you're going to have a patchiness of debris that is going to decompose more quickly, and then you've got parts that are going to decompose more slowly. So you're actually getting patchiness and diversity in time, not just space. So that's another cool thing. I'm a reptile amphibian. That's my specialty, and so I had to get that out because that's a big deal for reptiles and amphibians if you guys are into that. So, all right, guys, hope you found it enjoyable. And I'll just keep trying to bring you guys stuff like this as I come across it. Have a great day.